So good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anna Greco. I am the Director of Education at the Greenwich Historical Society, and we have actually been quite busy this winter. Next week, we're going to be hosting some vacation workshops during the winter break. So students will have an opportunity to come to the site, learn about pointillism, boat building, and monster puppet making. All of these are inspired by our town's history, and we will, of course, be masked and socially distanced. On February 18th, archivist and author Margot Note will be leading a workshop on Zoom for preserving your family archives. And on March 16th, we'll be hosting Keith Stokes, the vice president of the 1696 Heritage Group. Mr. Stokes is a highly accomplished businessman and preservationist, and he will be discussing the impact of God's Little Acre. This is the oldest and largest existing enslaved and free African heritage burying ground in America, and it dates back to 1705. And he will lead a discussion on restoration, research, and most importantly, how African heritage and history can be reclaimed and interpreted for today's audiences.
Do you want to watch this?
I hope that to see all of you at our upcoming programs and encourage you to visit our website, greenwichhistory.org, for more information. We also opened a new exhibition, The Lost Landscape Revealed, Childe Hassam and the Red Mill Cos Cob. And I would like to thank First Republic Bank for their support of the exhibition and tonight's program. This exhibition marks the curatorial debut of our Curator of Exhibitions and Museum Collections, Maggie Dimock. She holds an MA in the History of Decorative Arts from the Smithsonian and the Corcoran College of Art and Design, and a BA in Art History and Anthropology from St. Mary's College in Maryland. So Ms. Dimock joined the staff of the Greenwich Historical Society in the fall of 2019, and I think it's pretty safe to say that her first year came with some unexpected challenges. However, one exciting moment was the acquisition of a new Childe Hassam painting, the Red Mill Cos Cob, which is the central piece to this exhibition. Unfortunately, we could not have all of you join us for our traditional opening night celebrations, but we thought it would be nice to host something virtually. The Curator Happy Hour is intended to give all of you a look at the exhibition, and I would be remiss not to mention that you can visit it in person. We are taking reservations online, so all of this is available for an in-person experience. But tonight, Maggie will be taking you on a virtual tour of the exhibition, highlighting the key objects from our collection and the stories that they tell about Cos Cob's Lower Landing and the Cos Cob Art Colony. There is an opportunity to ask questions, and we invite you to do so in the chat room. Maggie will answer questions at the end of the program, and we also recommend that you use the speaker view during the tour. To help everyone get into the spirit of tonight, we posted the recipes of 2 cocktails that were popular during the late 19th century when Childe Hassam created the Red Mill Cos Cob. And I am drinking a gin fizz. This is 1.5 ounce gin, 0.75 ounces of lemon juice, an ounce of simple syrup, and it's simply shaken, strained, and then topped with a little soda water. And it's a light, refreshing drink, and I think it complements the painting very well, if not the weather that we're currently having. But I do want to say cheers, and I will now hand the evening over to our curator, Maggie Dimock.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thanks for that introduction, and I'm going to say cheers right back to you. I am coming to you from my living room tonight, which is very cozy, but obviously it's not the same as being in the gallery. But one perk is that we do get to have a little drink if we like to. So I'm enjoying a Manhattan, or at least I'm holding one. I don't know if I'll be enjoying it until after. But for myself, I don't know if I can rattle off a recipe in the way that Anna does, but I know for me, it's a generous pour of bourbon, some sweet vermouth, some dashes of bitters, and then shake it up and there you go, and put it in your tiny glass. So cheers, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am gonna go ahead and put my screen up for all of us to see. There we go. And as Anna mentioned, I'd love to be able to take some questions, but I think what we're going to do is wait till the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, if you want to put it into the chat, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation part of this. So what I'd love to do is give us kind of an introduction both to this exhibition and to this exciting acquisition that Anna mentioned. So let's see, let me just make sure that my slides want to advance for me here. There we go. So if you envision, if we weren't all in our homes right now, one thing, I wouldn't have a drink in hand. I also wouldn't be wearing slippers, which I am right now. But if you can envision, if I were greeting everyone, we'd be looking into our beautiful exhibitions gallery at the Historical Society's museum and library over in Cos Cob. And behind me, you would see, and you'd be able to take a close look at this really, really beautiful painting, really the star of the show and the reason that we put this show together. And that's this charming and vibrant painting by the American Impressionist artist, Childe Hassam. So this is the Red Mill Cos Cob. It was painted in 1896. Painted while Hassam was vacationing in Cos Cob for several weeks, lodging at the time at the boarding house that was run by Josephine and Edward Foley. They called it the Old House. And of course, today, that's the house that's under the stewardship of the Greenwich Historical Society, and we operate it as the Bush-Holley House Museum. Sadly, you can't really visit the Bush-Holley House right now. We've been closed since March, owing to the pandemic, hoping to be able to reopen at some point in the future. Usually the experience of visiting the Bush-Holley House is an incredibly intimate docent-led tour, but it's not really something that we've been able to offer lately. So we'll be able to sort of explore it in a virtual format today instead. So one thing I'll say, just sort of looking at this painting a little bit more closely, is what we're seeing here, the view that's depicted. It's not actually a mill at all, as the title would imply. It's actually the red buildings that you see, that complex of buildings with the kind of chimney that's rising from the center. It's a shipyard. It's a group of buildings that made up a shipyard that stood on that site from the middle of the 19th century, at least since the 1850s, possibly a little bit earlier than that. In the mid-19th century, they were building wooden ships there. Teams of workers, as many as 50 or 100 workers would be working there, making sails, building and doing carpentry on these large market ships, these schooners and sloops that were basically mostly used for transferring farm goods from Connecticut coastal communities down to New York City for market. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shipyard later. But once again, I want to sort of envision if we were standing in the entrance to our gallery at the Greenwich Historical Society, I'd be able to tell you to turn right around and look through the glass windows of our upper floor, because what you'd see behind you out across the way is the exact piece of land directly where that shipyard once stood. This is sort of a photograph that's taken a little bit further south along the coast, over towards the what is often now referred to as Palmer Point. Palmer and Duff were the folks that operated that shipyard. The Palmer Engine Company is another maritime industry that was there on Palmer Point a little bit later in the 20th century. Obviously, the one thing that's absent from this photograph that is impossible to miss today is the I-95 overpass, which also dominates the scene. So needless to say, the landscape has changed an awful lot from how it appeared in Hassam's time. So what I'd like to do in this talk is provide a deeper dive into the story of this painting and that landscape, that vanished landscape that it captures. And I'll do that in a way that's going to sort of mimic the experience of visiting the exhibit in person. And hopefully provide some historic context that would go beyond even, your experience of visiting the gallery. As Anna said, we are open. The Greenwich Historical Society is open. We're encouraging folks to make prior reservations so that you can come and visit with limited capacity and with social distancing observed. And so we do hope that you will come and see the show. It's going to be open through the end of March, through March 28th. So just to kind of take a step back here, my role at the Greenwich Historical Society, Anna mentioned I am the curator of exhibitions and collections. So I oversee our exhibitions program in terms of what's in our special exhibitions gallery in our museum and library building. And I also manage our museum collections. And for us, that includes all of the historic and interpretive furnishings, decorative arts, fine arts that are on display in the Bush-Holley House, as well as additional items, furniture, tools, textiles, historic costume, a myriad of other items that are not on permanent view. Visitors and friends who are familiar with the Bush-Holley House, you know that it's at its core a very traditional 18th century saltbox house. The oldest portions date to about 1730, with various later 18th and 19th century additions and various styles. Maybe most sort of iconically are these gracious double porches on the front of the house as they appear today. And today, visitors to the Bush-Holley House, they are able to learn not only about the most significant 18th century occupants of the house, which was the Bushes, a prosperous merchant family, and the owners of a tidal grist mill that once stood opposite the house on the shore of the Cos Cob Harbor. They also are able to learn about the story of enslaved people who lived here and worked here alongside the Bush family, both in domestic labor and also in that tide mill. But visitors, of course, are also introduced to the house's later life as a boarding house that was operated by the Holley family, Josephine and Edward Holley, and later their daughter, Constance Holley McRae, who was married to the artist Elmer Livingston McRae. And under the Holley's stewardship and operation of this boarding house, the old house here in Cos Cob became this locus of a gathering of artists and their students, writers, other intellectuals, and other cultural figures of the day. And this is what we referred to as the Cos Cob Art Colony. It was active about between 1890 and about 1920. So Greenwich Historical Society preserves and collects items that tell the history of Greenwich, but with a particular emphasis on the focus of interpreting that legacy of the Cos Cob Art Colony. So our collection, therefore, has beautiful examples of paintings and prints and works on paper by some of the best known artists associated with that group. So that's including John Henry Twachtman, Childe Hassam, of course, also Ernest Lawson, Kerr Eby, Elmer Livingston McRae, and several others as well. This is a view of our beautiful permanent collection gallery. So just looking here at our beautiful gallery wall, you can see works by McRae, by Ernest Lawson, and as well as two drawings by the Japanese artist Genjiro Yeto, who was also a big part of that art colony life in the 1890s. So this past summer, amid pandemic closures and this really unusual pace of life, we really had kind of a ray of light that came through the clouds in some ways with the opportunity to acquire this painting by Childe Hassam. Which this opportunity presented itself. We had some incredibly generous donors and friends of the Historical Society who were able to step up quickly and enable us to make this purchase. And we're so fortunate and so thankful that that was able to happen. I mean, apart from this being just a lovely painting. It's so vibrant in its colors. It's so characteristic of Hassam's work in its kind of jabbing brush strokes, that really animated surface. The composition itself is so interesting. You have that really high horizon line, and just the way that the light is playing on the sides of the buildings. I mean, it's a charming painting. It really brings you right in. But it's a gift to us in many ways, just in terms of how it lends itself to allowing our visitors and viewers to visualize and conceptualize the landscape that surrounded our historic site. which for us at the Historical Society, I mean, we're really interested in interpreting not only the Bush-Holley House, but really the entirety of the historic district that's facing Strickland Road, which we've, over the period of the last several years, and especially with the opening of our newly constructed museum and library building in 2018, with the rehabilitation of that 3-story Italianate railroad hotel that we often refer to as Toby's Tavern that you see in the far left of this photograph here. There's been such an effort and such a, I think, successful project of returning this streetscape to the appearance that this district, this area around what we often refer to as the Lower Landing in Cos Cob, this harborfront portion that used to be a busy marketplace and later was really sort of the downtown of the Cos Cob region, returning it to this period of significance tied to that Cos Cob art colony. So returning to our exhibit, what I'd like to do is dive in and talk about some of the context for this painting, for the Red Mill Cos Cob, and I'm going to approach it from a couple of different perspectives. And one thing I will say, you know, I've had such a, you know, fortunate time being able to work with our amazing collections and putting this exhibition together. But, you know, any project like this is always essentially a team effort. There are a lot of people at the Historical Society who've put work into putting this exhibit together, in designing it and conceptualizing it and researching it. And while I certainly am a curator who does specialize in the study of American decorative art and fine art of this period, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce these works for you and sort of tell this story, I really am indebted to the work of several art historians who really specialize in this area. And in particular, I want to single out Dr. Susan Larkin, we're fortunate enough to have on our board, who's really the foremost expert in the Cos Cob colony and who was really a big help in both acquiring this painting and making its case for its significance to our collection and our history and overseeing this exhibit. So in terms of how the show is put together, you know, I was really inspired by an idea that our exhibit design team had, in which they thought about the concept of kind of peeling back layers in one's approach to a painting, and kind of inviting you to kind of approach your understanding of a work of art from different points of view. So for example, we're going to be walking through and talking a bit about Childe Hassam in Cos Cob, his connection to this place and kind of how that shades our understanding of this painting. But also delving into what is sort of, I think, valid, interesting, you know, to the viewer as you're sort of thinking about the content of the painting itself, about the history of this shipbuilding industry in Cos Cob Harbor, about the Palmer and Duff Shipyard, and what we know about it. You know, by the 1890s, when Hassam was painting here, that shipyard was really kind of in a period of decline. And so, you know, the fact that that shipyard represented kind of a tie to this fading 19th century, you know, earlier 19th century industry was one of the things that Hassam and other artists found so appealing about painting in Cos Cob. You know, just the idea of this kind of somewhat, you know, frozen in time Connecticut coastal village that was a place apart from New York City, where a lot of them were coming from. So certainly another area that we kind of wanted to focus on, or what I thought was important to look at in this show, is the idea of painting this shipyard, the shipyard as an artist subject. You know, obviously it's a source of inspiration, and it became kind of the subject of several different artists' works while they were either staying in Cos Cob or living here, in the case of Elmer McRae. But also, you know, I think that thinking more so about the shipyard and Cos Cob's Lower Landing as a living, working community was an important aspect to explore as well. You know, paintings tend to kind of freeze a moment in time, and so they capture a lot about what an artist sees, but they also capture a lot about, you know, it's sort of the psychology of the artist in their particular approach to how they want to treat their subjects. So I thought sort of delving into some of the people that lived here and worked here was an important part of sort of appreciating what it is that people can see in that painting as well. And then finally, I wanted to kind of lift, widen the lens a little bit, I should say, in thinking about Cos Cob and the Lower Landing in that era. And in particular, I wanted to think about the sort of 20th century legacy and how things started to change, even just, 5-10 years after Hassam first began spending time here in the 1890s. And so we've got some really interesting objects that are tied to the later history of maritime industry in the Cos Cob Harbor that have to do with the Palmer Marine Engine Company, operated by a big factory that was operated by the Palmer brothers, starting in the beginning of the 20th century. So just to kind of get into it here, I think many of us probably have some familiarity with Childe Hassam. In many ways, he was one of the sort of most well-known artists and certainly one of the more successful painters who made up that kind of core part of the Cos Cob art colony of these folks that were boarding with the Holley family. Hassam was born in Boston, and he was largely self-taught, although he did spend time traveling through Europe, including at least a brief stint studying, formal training in Paris. But while he was traveling, he was absorbing the style and the approach of the French Impressionists, and he really established himself in New York City in the 1880s. And while he was based in New York, he spent a significant amount of time often traveling in New England. So certainly he would spend, in the 1880s and 90s, starting out time in the Isles of Shoals off of coastal New Hampshire and Maine. Also, at least a little bit later, he was a regular fixture as part of the art colony in Old Lyme, Connecticut, that sprung up around the home of Florence Griswold. And then, of course, a significant amount of time he would spend here in Cos Cob. Now, like a lot of the artists who kind of started, formed that kernel of the Cos Cob colony, Hassam really started coming here at the insistence of his friend, John Henry Twachtman. Twachtman purchased a house in Greenwich. It's still standing today. It's up on Round Hill Road in 1890. And we think there's evidence that Hassam first visited Twachtman in Greenwich in 94. But his first trip in which he spent time here in Cos Cob at the Holley boarding house was 2 years later in 1896. And of course, that's the same trip when he made his painting, The Red Mill, Cos Cob. Now, unlike Twachtman, Hassam never taught. He didn't take on students. I mean, part of the draw and the reason that so many folks were visiting and staying with the Holleys in Cos Cob is because they were taking summer painting courses under Twachtman as enrolled students in the Art Students League. So one thing I want to kind of think about here is how much we kind of associate Hassam with Cos Cob, but chiefly through scenes, mostly interior scenes that he's painted within the confines of the Holley boarding house. So I think a lot of folks are familiar with some of Hassam's, later works from the 19-teens. Some of these series that are often referred to as his Woman in the Window series. This is a beautiful painting that's up at the Courier Museum of Art in Manchester, New Hampshire, that was painted in the what we now refer to as sort of the lintry in the Holley House. The model, the woman that's standing there in the kimono, is actually the daughter of a saloon owner, Tobias Burke, who is the proprietor of what we often refer to now as Toby's Tavern. That's his daughter, Helen Burke. So I think that within our exhibition, what we've been able to do is kind of give a sense of Hassam's oeuvre of these scenes of women in domestic spaces, borrowing from our own collection. So any of you who've spent any significant time in the Bush-Holley House might have seen these paintings before. This is a really charming pair of little panels, paintings, oil studies, that were, in fact, at least one of them we know was done on the back of a cigar box lid. So they're very, kind of, excuse me, quickly painted. They're very diminutive in size, about, this big. What we're looking at on the left is a portrait of Josephine Holley. She's seated in the dining room of the Holley House. And then on the right, the figure who's shown standing in front of that federal mantelpiece is most likely Hassam's wife, Maud Hassam. And she would frequently come and stay in the Holley House with Hassam. The two of them would stay together. And in fact, that room that she's shown standing in that painting is the first floor bedroom, which we now interpret as the so-called best bedroom in the Bush-Holley House. So just to give you a sense, that this is a photograph, a contemporary photograph of the dining room today as it's interpreted to the period of the Cos Cob art colony in the Bush-Holley House. And then this is a period photograph of a group of boarders who are in that first floor bedroom that we know, just based on some correspondence, that Childe Hassam and his wife often stayed in, and in fact requested to be able to stay in when they were staying at the Holley House. In fact, in the exhibition, you can see we've got this letter from Constant Holly McRae, where she's writing to her mother, and when she's referencing that the Hassams are going to be staying in the big room downstairs with the stove. She's got the stove going for them. So, the Childe Hassam, after the first visit he made to Cos Cob, to the Holley House in 1896, he returned for weeks at a time, sometimes months at a time, almost every year, the next several years up until 1918. So, he was very friendly with the Holley family. He was really kind of a fixture of their house. What we have shown here in our exhibition, just to kind of give a sense of his work, are a set of beautiful etchings, Hassam's etchings. This is another view of another woman sort of dressed in this very stylish kimono, Japanese kimono, and she's actually seated in front of the fireplace mantle in the dining room of the Bush-Holley House, or the Holley House as it was then. And then I also included in this exhibition a view that Hassam had done, this etching of the Cos Cob dock from 1915. And what's interesting, Hassam kind of got into printmaking and etching later in life. And in fact, part of what really sort of set him down that path is while he was staying with the Holleys here in Cos Cob, he was friendly with another artist by the name of Kerr Eby. Kerr Eby was a printmaker who actually rented rooms in or basically studio space, an apartment space in an old warehouse building that was on the shore of Cos Cob Harbor. And actually, I'm showing you right now, this is another etching by Kerr Eby that's part of our collection, it's part of the show. And so the building I'm referring to where he was living for a time is that kind of barn-like warehouse structure that's at the far left of this scene. And actually, this is a photograph taken of that same piece of waterfront on the Cos Cob Harbor from roughly around the time that this print was made, probably maybe 5 or 10 years earlier. One thing that I want to point out that I think is kind of interesting, especially when you're using something like an etching as a point of trying to sort of understand the lay of the land and sort of figure out how it corresponds to the actual situation of buildings. Remember that when you're making a print in the etching process, the design that's on the printing plate, the copper plate, is going to be reversed when it prints onto the paper. And so unless an artist makes an attempt to reverse their design such that when they etch it into the plate, it's inverted. It's going to be printed sort of upside down or backwards, or inverted, I should say. So if you watch quickly, I'm going to sort of flip that paint or that print on the left-hand side of your screen. And so you can see that as E.B. originally depicted the scene, it matches a little bit more faithfully to that photograph. So speaking of the idea of situating ourselves into a landscape, I wanted to return to this photograph of Twachtman with one of his students, and just to kind of give you a sense of where we are here. Twachtman is standing, he's facing the camera person. They're standing on that peninsula, which was opposite the Holley House. And in fact, they're standing on that peninsula where the Palmer and Duff shipyard that Hassam depicted in his painting was situated. So this next image is actually kind of showing you a similar vantage point, just a few steps to the right of where that last photograph was taken. And if you look straight ahead, you actually see that's the Holley House sort of peeking through this closer row of waterfront warehouses. And on the far right here, that kind of taller building with the steeply angled roof, that is the tide mill, the 18th century tide mill that was constructed in the Bush era, when the Bush family was living in the house opposite, and which, as of the taking of this photograph, was still standing on the waterfront. And in fact, here is another picture that's taken. This looks as though it was taken from the upper porch of the Holley House. So we're now looking in the opposite direction, over towards that grist mill, that tidal mill, from the opposite direction. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that there was a fire, a pretty major fire in 1899 that burned down not only the mill, but several of the attached, at that point, century-old warehouses that were all lining the waterfront opposite the Holley House. So if you look at this photograph that was taken not precisely from the same place, but again, sort of on the side of Strickland Road with the Holley House to your back, you can see this is from 1906. And so that waterfront view was just completely opened up by the destruction of those historic buildings. And so what you are looking at there in this photograph is the Palmer and Duff shipyard that Hassam depicted in his painting. And actually, the photograph that's on the right of your screen right now mimics a little bit more precisely the vantage point that Hassam would have been sort of standing at when he was sketching out and painting this view. Now let's see. Taking a look at the photographs I have here. Yeah. So one thing that you'll see in the exhibition that we put together is a map that kind of helps to situate folks in that landscape and get a sense for where all of these buildings are in relationship to one another. I think on your screen, it's probably a little bit tough to actually read some of these. But I think another thing that we were really interested in being able to do was on this diagram that's on the right is kind of, take apart the puzzle pieces of those different buildings in the painting and kind of try to make sense of what was going on there. So, one piece of information that became pretty apparent just from looking at some newspaper articles from the era, especially the 1880s when there was a lot of activity happening over at that shipyard, is that chimney, that really prominent chimney that rises up from the cluster of buildings, was more likely than not part of a blacksmith shop in a forge that was part of that complex, so that they were forging their own nails and other metal pieces that were used in the shipbuilding process. And to put together a map like this, I mean, we were looking at sources like this 1912 Sanborn fire insurance map, which is a fantastic record of a lot of the commercial spaces as they existed at that particular point in time. We're also looking at various aerial photographs. Of course, the earliest aerial photographs we have are from the 1920s. I think this one on the right is either from 1929 or maybe in the 1930s. But it gives you a sense of kind of where all of these buildings were in the landscape before, the 20th century wore on, and eventually these buildings started to disappear. I mentioned that this part of Cos Cob, these kind of commercial structures were really, part of what brought artists here to paint, and sort of what, part of what was the appeal of staying here. And so I did want to just sort of give a sense of other artists who are part of this cluster of the Cos Cob colony, who were looking at that same shipyard and painting it. So we're looking right now at a much sort of different in style and in terms of color palette, certainly, painting by Charles Ebert, which is actually now in the collection of the Florence Griswold Museum. Ebert and his wife, who is also an artist, met one another in Cos Cob, and they lived here for a period of time, although eventually they did relocate to Old Lyme, and they're really active in the Old Lyme art colony as well. I also wanted to share, this is, I think, just a beautiful painting by Theodore Robinson from just a few years prior to when Hassam first visited Cos Cob. This is a different angle of that same set of buildings that made up the shipyard. We're actually looking at it from the south, so we're kind of standing down in this marshy landscape and looking north up sort of through where the Mianus River kind of dissipates into, one branch over to the east, and then the kind of marshy Cos Cob Harbor over to the west. And I wanted to kind of point out, there's a really distinctive structure that doesn't appear in Hassam's painting, but it's kind of to the center right of Robinson's canvas. And that's this barn, this work shed that has those really distinctive three arched openings. And you can see it here in this photograph of a group of workers who are working at the shipyard in about the 1890s. And then just finally, I wanted to show you just, so completely different in terms of style and execution, this view by John Henry Twachtman from the front porch of the Holley House, looking over towards that shipyard. I mean, it's so, so minimal really in its use of detail, but so atmospheric. I mean, it's obviously one of Twachtman's really distinctive winter scenes. But I think it's significant if you compare it again to that photograph that we saw before of the shipyard. From just about the same angle, you can see that in simplifying it to those very sort of block-like forms, Twachtman is really quite faithfully reproducing that view. And then I wanted to, this is just, I think, another lovely Hassam painting from 1902, in which he's once again returning to Cos Cob and returning to this similar subject matter, looking over towards the Palmer and Duff shipyard. Although in this case, he's really focusing more so on the oyster sloop that's docked here on the bank of that peninsula where the shipyard is situated. Of course, that fisherman who's standing in that small boat. One thing I'll say though is if you compare in the painting on your left, this 1902 painting, that yellow structure, that yellow building is in fact the same structure that you see in the Red Mill, Cos Cob, which is on the right of your screen, although the building at that point in time, so this is a few years earlier, you have to remember, was painted, it seems as though it was painted sort of a two-toned red and yellow. So it's appearing at the far left of the Red Mill Cos Cob, that two-toned building. And you can actually see it. And in fact, I think, do I have a little, there we go. It's circled here in this photograph from just about the year 1900. That building was originally a residence, but it was used by the Palmer and Duff shipyard folks as a storefront. And so, in fact, in this photograph, what you see is that's Denham Palmer, one of the two owners of Palmer and Duff. He's standing on the north-facing front porch of that storefront building. So this would have been, for those of you who are familiar with the area, this structure would have faced north onto River Road. And in fact, just if you kind of look closely, if you gaze kind of off in the distance there, very faintly, you can see the 3-story hotel where Toby's Tavern was located that's off in the distance. In fact, here's another photograph that's a little bit clearer. So this is kind of looking at that same view over back across the harbor. Once again, you see that warehouse on the waterfront where I mentioned that Kurt Eby had his studio, and then the hotel, the Railroad Hotel, with Toby's Tavern on the ground floor is opposite that on the other side of the road. So thinking, about treating the shipyard as a subject of paintings, as an artist subject, I think I was really interested in including a couple of canvases by the painter Elmer Livingston McRae in this show. And the reason for that is not only are they, just I think really breathtaking paintings. This is from about 1910. It's obviously a very kind of morose nighttime winter scene, painted. The view is most likely from the upper porch of the Holley House over towards that shipyard with its distinctive smokestack. But one thing to remember is that McRae, Elmer Livingston McRae, because he married Constance Holley and he moved to Cos Cob, he lived here for the rest of his life. And so as opposed to someone like Hassam or Theodore Robinson, who was spending time here as kind of a retreat, and really the center of their life and their work was in New York, Elmer McRae was painting his own neighborhood, really his backyard. This is another McRae painting. Once again, in this case, it's quite different in style and execution. He's actually kind of incorporated the railings of the porch of the Bush-Holley House, I should say, in his composition. So he's looking again across this frozen river, the frozen Cos Cob Harbor and Mianus River, looking over towards the Palmer and Duff Shipyard. I think it's interesting. And this painting, you can see over to the far right, there's the railroad bridge that's crossing the harbor. If you go back a slide here, although these two paintings were from about the same period, in this one, he's chosen to omit that railroad bridge. So he's going for a little bit of I think a more sparse aesthetic in which he's maybe trying to erase the influx of the 20th century, maybe. And I do want to share, although I don't have quite as good of a photograph of it, because this is actually the one painting in this installation that's not coming from our collection. It's from a loan from a private collection. On the far left here is another beautiful wintertime scene of the Palmer and Duff Shipyard, painted by Elmer McRae. And what I think is so notable about this painting, apart from being just one of the nicest McRae paintings that I've seen in many ways, I think it mimics so closely Hassam's vantage point, and especially the framing of that harbor with the sort of treatment of that near bank that's in the foreground there, even down to the kind of dry brush, sort of almost sketchy way that McRae has painted those details in that foreground. I think it really mimics the way that Hassam approached the same subject. So significantly, Elmer McRae not only was painting the Palmer and Duff Shipyard, sort of viewing it as an artist subject, but he also, they were his neighbors. And so one thing that we have in the show here is, this is a receipt that is part of some of the historic papers in our archival collections that come from the Holley and McRae family, who of course left the, or sold the Holley House, the Bush-Holley House, to the Historical Society in 1957. We actually have a receipt. They were purchasing coal from the Palmer and Duff Company in order to heat the Holley House. Palmer and Duff actually, they dealt in coal and other paint supplies in addition to shipbuilding. And in fact, we also have here a letter from Elmer McRae to his mother-in-law, Josephine Holley. They're reporting on some of the business of running the boarding house. And he's mentioning how he went over and purchased coal from Palmer and Duff. By the time the Cos Cob colony was really going strong, Palmer and Duff was kind of not exactly in decline in terms of business, but I mean, they were certainly very busy, but they were mostly doing repair work on, existing wooden ships. Earlier in the 19th century, I mean, they were responsible for building some of the sort of most notable tall, large sloops and schooners that were working these market routes, these packet ship routes to and from New York City. So, what we're looking at here is basically the sort of log of goods that have been transported on the schooner Monunkatuk, which we know was, if not constructed at Palmer and Duff, it was certainly frequently on the ways, as they say at Palmer and Duff, meaning that it was undergoing repairs. And apparently, the Monunkatuk was such a well-regarded or well-known site on Long Island Sound, and so so much a part of the fixture of the Cos Cob community that I found at one point come across this poem that someone had written, an ode to the schooner Monunkatuk, that was printed in the Greenwich Graphic in the 1880s. So really, when we think about Cos Cob Harbor and what was happening here at the shipyard, we're talking about the major center of industry at a certain point in time. This is another McRae painting in which I just think it's sort of interesting to be able to see, the preponderance of both large and small sailing craft that are docked here in the harbor at that period of time. This was painted in 1910. And so at this point, we're already seeing a marked difference in the type of water traffic that's happening, or that's coming through Cos Cob Harbor. It's more so pleasure yachts, pleasure craft, maybe the occasional oysterman. One thing that we get into a little bit in the exhibit is based on some oral history information, we think that we can identify the captain of that large schooner that's depicted in Elmer McRae's painting as a fellow named Benjamin Wilmot, who lived, according to the 1910 census or 1900 census, on Strickland Road, just a few houses away from the Holley House. So I'm kind of mindful of time here, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I am going to wrap up here. But I think before I do, the one sort of facet of the show I did want to give a little brief mention to is this look at the 20th century aspect of maritime history as it relates to Palmer Point and what used to be the location of the Palmer and Duff Shipyard. So what we're looking at here is an illustration of the Palmer Brothers factory, which, just to give you a sense, this is an aerial photograph. The circle in red is the Palmer and Duff Shipyard, which is depicted in Hassam's painting. Whereas the green circle over to the right is where the later Palmer Brothers factory building was constructed sometime just after 1901. And in fact, the Palmer brothers, distant relations, and although not direct relations to Denham Palmer of Palmer and Duff, they were manufacturers of marine engines. So they were, in fact, at one point actually were building small boats as well. But the Palmer engines, for decades, up through the 1960s, were really one of the kind of high water marks in American boat engines. In fact, there's sort of apocryphal stories that we hear about how Palmer engines were favored by rum runners and bootleggers during the Prohibition years. They wanted their ships to be able to outrun the cops, and so they would make sure they had a good Palmer engine. But we have just part of our collections, and what we wanted to share in this show is just a really fascinating legacy of print catalogs having to do with the Palmer Engine Company, which at one point employed several hundred workers. We've got some lovely original kind of ceremonially mounted engine part molds that are part of the installation here. And so what I think I'll conclude on is I love this photograph of some of the fellows who were working over at the Palmer Engine Company. This is probably close to about 1900, 1910 that this photograph was taken. And I think it's kind of worth reflecting on, as we think about that moment in time that's frozen in Hassam's painting of the Palmer and Duff Shipyard. Obviously, you don't really have to imagine too hard if you haven't actually been to the Bush-Holley House or the Greenwich Historical Society in Cos Cob. I think looking at these two photographs gives you all you need to know in terms of understanding how much the landscape has changed in the intervening decades. But part of what's so, I think, fascinating about a painting like this is how much it allows us to connect to telling that story of our past, and then the way that we can kind of delve into it in more detail. So it's exciting for us. It's an exciting painting for us to have in our collection, and I really appreciate being able to speak about it. And I'm going to end there, although I would love to maybe answer some questions if we have folks that want to stick around. So thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. And we do have some questions coming in. One from McKinney is asking Evie Studio, Care Evie, who was another artist who was a part of this colony, if you're not familiar with him specifically, was his studio across River Road from the Bush-Holley House or across the bridge and down River Road? So where is it?
His studio, and I'm not, just because I think I'd have to flick back too many slides, I'm not going to go try to get a photograph, but it may be helpful. His studio was actually on the opposite side of Strickland Road from the Holley House. So it was, if and again, I'm hoping the person who asked has some familiarity with the area. If the Bush-Holley House and the Greenwich Historical Society's campus is on the western side of Strickland Road, across the road is the water, and Evie's studio was on that waterfront on the other side of the road in that warehouse, which was a little bit further south along Strickland Road.
We do have questions coming in. Thank you, everyone. Charlotte and Lloyd are asking, can you tell us more about how the Greenwich Historical Society came to acquire this painting and where it came from?
Yeah. So this painting was in auction. It came up for auction at Christie's this summer. And we, part of we've got a fantastic collections committee at the Historical Society, and folks who are both on our board and active on that committee, who really are paying attention to the market, especially the market for American art. And so we were alerted through them to the fact that this painting was coming up for auction. It's a painting which has been in private hands essentially since Hassam died in 1935. It had most recently been in a private collection, which was then being auctioned as part of an estate after the collector had passed away. And so it's a painting that we were aware of, and we kind of knew that it was out there in the world, but it hadn't really had a history of being publicly exhibited. And so, in this case, we were fortunate in the sense that it being a pandemic, the market for American art is a little bit more forgiving than it has been in the last several years. We also were able to bid on this painting. It was an online auction because, of course, even major auction houses like Christie's aren't doing in-person auctions. So there were, and also through some really savvy, back and forth in negotiations with some collections focused friends of ours, we were able to acquire this and at a price that was really, worked very well for us. And I think that in a situation like this, it's so good that a painting can end up in a public collection like ours. It's really, I think, it's kind of the best possible scenario that the painting came to us, and so we're able to share it with the public and have it be a means of being able to tell this story of our history. So that's sort of a little bit about the background.
We have one more question from MB. Any documentation or evidence of mentioned parties, i.e. shipping companies, etc., in the slave trade, particularly with the slave trade ships in other areas of Connecticut, such as the Amistad? So I guess the shipping companies that you've mentioned, or
yeah. So to my knowledge, and I should say that I can't say that I've done enough research to be like exhaustive in this answer. If the question is thinking about, what can we say about, for example, was an outfit like Palmer and Duff manufacturing ships that may have been used in the slave trade? I'm going to say most likely not, just because they were, well, for one thing, Palmer and Duff only came about in 1858. So that was, they weren't founded and they weren't operating until 1858, which is a bit late. My understanding is that for the most part, what they were building were these smaller, quite large, but relatively small packet boats that were, coasters, they would call them. They mainly sailed along the coast. So they would go, they would visit coastal marketplaces in Connecticut and then go down to New York City. So, we're not talking about transatlantic ships here. But that's, I also should admit that I don't really know anything with any definition here. So I'm speculating just based on context. I don't know, Anna, is there any thoughts you have about that?
Sure. And I'll speak for a moment on this. I'm going to try and well, I might be able to get my image to come up, but MB, we are doing extensive research about the people who were enslaved on our site at this time. There's another program that's actually we've launched last year. There's been some delay with COVID, but we've partnered with the Witness Stones Project. So we're working with local schools to look deeper at our own history and the primary source documentation on the people who were enslaved. So we know of at least 15 people who were enslaved on the site during the Bush time period when the Bush family were there. And they did enslave them. As far as the ships are concerned, that is research that is yet to be done. If you would like to contact me directly, my email is agreco@greenwichhistory.org. And I'm happy to just follow up and share with you some more information. Some of my coworkers might be able to just share a little bit more. We don't know of any people specifically that would have been on the ships, but it's potentially and likely that there may have been goods that were shipped down to the Caribbean. And that's current research that we're doing. So I don't want to speak too definitively about it, but if you follow up, I'd be happy to share with you what we have. Thanks. Any more questions to be shared? We still have a few minutes. Sarah said yes, she has a question. Where does the painting fit into his career?
Sorry, I decided it was time for me to imbibe part of my cocktail. So Hassam, he after growing up, starting his career as sort of a young artist and illustrator in Boston, and then spending a fair amount of time traveling through Europe, he ended up in New York City and really kind of in many ways, started his sort of career as a commercially successful, or not, well, I would say financially successful artist in the late 1880s, around, I think it was 1889. And so he was first visiting Cos Cob in the 1890s. This painting was done, if I didn't sort of make this clear enough, this is one of the first paintings he ever made in Cos Cob. We know that he was staying with the Holleys in September of 1896, and he only made a handful of paintings during that trip, and this was one of them. Hassam died in 35, and he was an incredibly prolific artist. So it's I would say sort of on the early to mid, the early part of his sort of mid-career, and in many ways probably when he was at the height of his powers. I mean, I think it's just in terms of his approach to the subject matter, and just where it fits within his career. It's a unique painting for him, but it's a really, really, it's a nice one. I just think in execution is, and part of that's just sort of my 2 cents, but.
All right, well, I just want to say thank you, Maggie, for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you for putting together such a beautiful exhibition. If you do have a chance, the exhibition is open until what date? I should know this, but
March 28th, March 28th.
All right, so you are welcome to come.
Oh, sorry, Anna, I didn't mean to talk over you. I was just going to say, and for those who are wondering, you will have an opportunity to see the painting itself even after the exhibition is over. So the painting won't go back into storage. In fact, what we're in the works right now is having it on at least for the foreseeable future permanent display in our permanent collection gallery of Cos Cob, works from the Cos Cob colony. So the painting won't be going away.
That's so exciting. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you'll come and see the exhibition. And then I do also want to put a plug for our next one, which will be on the Gardens of Greenwich, opening at the end of April. So lots to see and enjoy at the Greenwich Historical Society. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.